Murder slipped in between courses, unnoticed until too late. Welcome to the Silent Clueworks. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Let me know where you're listening from. Your comments truly mean a lot. Now, into the mystery. The trouble with living in Nero Wolfe's house is that you develop standards. Not moral standards. Those were optional when I took the job, but standards about food, wine, and the proper rhythm of daily life. Which is why I knew something was wrong the moment I walked into the office that Tuesday morning and found Wolfe reading a letter twice. He was behind his desk in the oversized chair that's the only piece of furniture in Manhattan capable of supporting a seventh of a ton with dignity. The morning mail lay sorted on his blotter, bills in one stack, circulars in another, and serious correspondence in a third. But he was holding a single sheet of cream-colored paper, and his lips were pushed out in the expression he reserves for inferior wine or superior problems. I settled into the red leather chair. Good news or bad news? Neither, Wolfe said, setting down the letter. A proposition. From someone who can spell. From someone who can cook. He picked up the letter again. Listen to this. Mr. Wolfe, I am writing to request your assistance with a matter that may seem trivial, but threatens to destroy my reputation and livelihood. My name is Marcel Frontenac, and I am the executive chef at Le Bernardin Noir, the private dining establishment on East 62nd Street. For the past 18 months, I have been hosting monthly dinners for a select group of 12 gastronomes, what we call the Circle of Epicurus. Each dinner features 7 courses, each paired with wines chosen to complement not only the food, but the conversation. These are not mere meals, Mr. Wolfe. They are symphonies. Someone is sabotaging them. 3 months ago, a bottle of 1947 Chateau d'Yquem was replaced with inferior Sauterne. The substitution was so skillful that I did not discover it until the wine was served. 2 months ago, my private spice collection was tampered with. Someone replaced my saffron with turmeric powder. Last month, the menu for our November dinner was stolen from my locked office and circulated among food critics before the event. These incidents are not random. They are calculated attacks on my professional standing, designed to humiliate me before the most influential palates in New York. The next dinner is this Saturday. I fear what may happen if this pattern continues. I cannot offer your usual fee, but I can offer you something perhaps more valuable. A place at the table. The November menu will feature dishes I have spent 2 years perfecting, paired with wines from my personal cellar. If you would attend as my guest and observe, perhaps you might identify the source of these difficulties. Respectfully, Marcel Frontenac. Wolfe set the letter down and looked at me. Well what? You haven't left this house for dinner since Roosevelt was president. The first Roosevelt. The man has been systematically tormented, Wolfe said. His artistry has been perverted, his reputation attacked through the corruption of his materials. It is intolerable. It's also not murder, kidnapping, or theft of anything worth more than a good bottle of wine. Since when do we take cases involving hurt feelings and tampered spices? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Since the victim is Marcel Frontenac. You know him? I know his work. His father was Auguste Frontenac, who trained under Escoffier. Marcel studied in Lyon, worked in Paris, and came to New York 5 years ago. His Sola la Diepoise is flawless. His Canard aux Cerises is transcendent. Wolfe paused. He is, quite possibly, the finest chef currently working in Manhattan. High praise from a man who thinks Fritz walks on water. Fritz is superb within his range. Frontenac operates in a different sphere entirely. Wolfe reached for his pen. Call him. Tell him I will attend his dinner Saturday evening. I stared at him. You'll what? Attend. Observe. Eat. He began writing. And if someone is indeed sabotaging his work, see, I will identify them and put a stop to it. You realize this means leaving the house, getting dressed, sitting at a table with 11 strangers, making conversation. I realize it means eating 7 courses prepared by a master, paired with wine selected by an expert, in the company of people who understand the difference between nourishment and mere consumption. Wolfe finished writing and handed me the note. Send this immediately. I read his response, a brief acceptance that managed to sound both gracious and imperial, and looked up. What if it's just some practical joker with a grudge? What if there's no real mystery here? Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Then I will have enjoyed an exceptional meal. But I suspect, Archie, that before Saturday's dinner is finished, we will discover that someone's taste for mischief has developed into an appetite for something considerably more serious. The way he said it made me reach for the phone a little faster than usual. In my experience, when Nero Wolfe starts talking about appetites, somebody usually ends up dead. If you think Nero Wolfe deciding to leave the house for dinner is a small item, you haven't been paying attention. It was like hearing that the Statue of Liberty had booked a cruise. I put in the call to Le Bernardin Noir with the solemnity of notifying the Pentagon. A woman with a French accent answered, not the kind that comes in a bottle with a fancy label, but the kind that has been through customs. Le Bernardin Noir. This is Archie Goodwin, calling for Nero Wolfe. I understand you have a chef in distress. There was a short silence. Just one moment, please. I waited, watching Wolfe. He had closed his eyes, which means either he was thinking or rehearsing sources in his mind. The line clicked and a man's voice came on. Low, controlled, with the edge of somebody who takes his work personally. Mr. Goodwin, this is Marcel Frontenac. Right. Mr. Frontenac, Mr. Wolfe has read your letter and agreed to attend your Circle of Epicurus dinner this Saturday, as your guest and as a professional observer. I could almost hear the man exhale. That is, I'm very honored. I was not certain he would even consider. He has considered, I said. He'll need details. Time, dress code, layout, and he wants a complete list of the 12 regulars, with backgrounds, addresses, and how long they've been in the circle. Also, anyone who's left it in the last year, thus and all staff who have access to your wine and spices. Wolfe's eyes opened and aimed at me, but he didn't object. Good, we were on the same page. Frontenac cleared his throat. The dinner begins at 8 o'clock. Black tie. I can have a complete dossier messengered to you this afternoon. As for staff, it is a small operation. Myself, my sous-chef Henri Ducasse, sommelier Paolo Ricci, and a handful of trusted servers. Good. You should also know Mr. Wolfe intends to treat this as a professional engagement. He will expect your full cooperation, and he does not like being lied to. I have no reason to lie, Mr. Goodwin. My enemy is not Nero Wolfe. Sometimes people have more than one, I told him. Send the list, and one more thing. Have there been any quarrels at the table? Ugly scenes? Somebody sending back a course with drama? Never, he said, and he meant it. We are gourmets, not children. I hung up and gave Wolfe the rundown. He grunted when I reached the part about gourmets, not children. Idiocy, he muttered. No human activity involving pride, money, or appetite is exempt from childishness. The materials arrived at 3:30, delivered by a nervous kid who looked like he'd been threatened with dismemberment if he didn't get a signature. I took the thick envelope to Wolfe's desk and watched him open it with the care most people reserve for defusing bombs. Inside was a typed guest list with handwritten annotations, floor plans, staff schedules, and detailed incident reports. Wolfe spread everything across his desk methodically. 12 current members, I said, scanning the list. Dr. Sylvia Chen, a food historian. James Carmichael, restaurant critic for The Times. Frontenac notes he's been increasingly critical lately. Victor Halloway, wine importer who had a falling out with Frontenac over disputed Burgundy. Patricia Vance, cookbook author. Thomas Brennan, who owns competing restaurants in Boston. I continued through the list. Elena Moretti, food photographer. Richard Ashford, amateur sommelier and hotel heir. Amanda Sterling, restaurant investor. David Park, molecular gastronomy researcher. Nicole Beaumont, French cultural attaché, and Father Joseph Keating, who apparently writes about the theology of food. Each with access, opportunity, and potential motive, Wolfe observed. But look at this, I said, pointing to a handwritten addendum. 3 former members who left in the last 12 months. Dr. Oscar Bruck, the cardiologist, left due to health concerns. Howard Yates, venture capitalist, left abruptly after an argument about the July menu. Philip Dane, food writer, ceased attending without explanation. Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. When did the sabotage begin? 3 months ago, right after these departures. Precisely. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. The substitution of wine, the tampering with spices, the theft of the menu, these are not random vandalism. They are surgical strikes against different aspects of the same target. Frontenac's authorship. Meaning, the man composes a meal the way Beethoven wrote a symphony. Wine, seasoning, sequence, all elements of his artistic expression. Whoever is doing this is not merely humiliating him. They're inserting their own hand into his work. They're rewriting his composition line by line. Like a collaborator with a grudge? Exactly. And the pattern is escalating. From private discovery to public disaster to professional sabotage. Wolfe tapped the papers. Find out which of these people would most resent being merely an audience, never a creator. Frustration ferments mischief, Archie. The 3 who left the circle, among others. But remember, patterns have momentum. Saturday's dinner will not pass without incident. The question is whether we can identify the perpetrator before they complete whatever finale they have planned. The way he said finale made me reach for my hat a little faster than usual. Wednesday morning found me doing what I do best, asking questions that make people uncomfortable and watching their faces when they realize I'm not going away. And the list of former circle members wasn't long, but it was interesting, and Wolfe's theory about frustrated creators had given me a place to start poking. Dr. Oscar Bruck lived in a 5th Avenue apartment that probably cost more per month than most people earn in a year. He was 72, thin as a rail, and had the kind of face that makes you think about mortality whether you want to or not. When I mentioned the circle of Epicurus, his expression went from polite to guarded faster than a clam snapping shut. I left for medical reasons, he said, standing in his doorway like a sentry. My cardiologist recommended dietary restrictions. Funny thing about that, I said, settling into the conversation like I planned to stay. Your cardiologist is Dr. Raymond Chen, husband of Sylvia Chen, who's still in the circle. He didn't recommend she stop attending 7-course extravaganzas. Bruck's jaw tightened. My situation is different. I'm sure it is. What happened at the July dinner? Nothing happened. Then why did Howard Yates storm out halfway through the main course? And why did you and Philip Dane follow him? His eyes flickered with something between annoyance and fear. After a long moment, he stepped back and let me into his living room, all white furniture and abstract art that probably meant something to somebody with more money than sense. Frontenac is a tyrant, Brooke said flatly. He demands absolute silence during service, forbids any criticism of his pairings, and treats his guests like students in a classroom. At the July dinner, Yates suggested the Montrachet was served too cold. Frontenac became unpleasant. How unpleasant? He asked Yates to leave, said anyone who couldn't appreciate proper serving temperature had no business at his table. Brooke's mouth twisted like he was tasting something bitter. I defended Yates. Frontenac invited me to leave as well. I did. I haven't returned. And Philip Dane left the same night. Called Frontenac a pretentious fraud on his way out. Bruck looked at me with the expression of a man who'd said more than he intended. Now, if you'll excuse me, just one more thing. You think any of your fellow exiles would hold a grudge? The kind that involves switching wine labels and tampering with spice jars? His face went carefully blank. I wouldn't know anything about that. But he did know something. I could see it in the way his eyes shifted toward the window. And I left him standing in his white living room, looking like a man with secrets he was determined to keep. Howard Yates was easier to find, but harder to read. He ran a venture capital firm in Midtown and had the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from making money off other people's ideas. When I walked into his office, he was on the phone yelling at someone about quarterly projections. He waved me to a chair without breaking stride. I don't care what Tokyo says. Move the capital or find another fund. He slammed the phone down and looked at me with calculating eyes. Goodwin, right? You've got 10 minutes. Talk fast. I talked. He listened with the expression of a man weighing odds and finding them interesting. Yeah, I walked out, he said when I finished. Frontenac's an artist, I get it. But artists need patrons. And some patrons don't enjoy being lectured like children. The wine was too cold. I said so. He threw a tantrum. Brooke says Frontenac asked you to leave. Brooke's a coward who can't admit he was looking for an excuse to quit. His wife made it clear she didn't want her husband's colleague at the same table as her. Professional rivalry or something. Sylvia Chen doesn't like competition in the food history field. That was a new angle. And Philip Dane? Yates grinned without warmth. Dane's a bottom feeder who writes restaurant reviews for websites nobody reads. He was thrilled to be invited to the circle, but Frontenac kept correcting his wine commentary. Publicly. By July, Dane was ready to explode. When Frontenac kicked me out, Dane saw his chance to exit with dignity. You think any of them would sabotage Frontenac's dinners? Bruck? No, he's too proper. Dane? Maybe. He's got the grudge and the access. He still covers restaurants in that neighborhood. Yates leaned back in his chair. But if you want my professional opinion, you're looking at this wrong. How so? You're assuming the saboteur is an enemy. What if it's a friend? What if someone inside wants to prove Frontenac's fallible? Not destroy him, just knock him down a peg. Make him human. That's a pretty elaborate way to make a point. Rich people do elaborate things when they're bored, Goodwin. Trust me, I finance them. I left his office with more questions than answers, which is usually how these things go. But one thing was clear. The Circle of Epicurus wasn't just a dining club. It was a pressure cooker, and somebody had been turning up the heat for months. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office reading a book on French wine regions. I gave him the full report, including the conflicting versions of the July dinner and Yates' theory about an inside job. Interesting, he said when I finished. 3 men with 3 different versions of the same event, each protecting himself while implicating the others. So which one's lying? Probably all of them, Wolfe said, setting down his book. The question is what they're lying about. Brooke claims moral superiority but clearly resents being humiliated. Yates presents himself as a rational businessman but admits to enjoying conflict. And we haven't heard from Dane yet. You still think it's one of the current members? I think, Wolfe said slowly, that we're dealing with someone who understands Frontenac's psychology intimately. Now, the sabotage isn't random, it's surgical. Wine, spices, menu, each attack targets a different aspect of his artistry. That suggests either a former collaborator with detailed knowledge or a current member with extended access. He glanced at the clock. Frontenac arrives tomorrow at 11. By then, I want you to have spoken with Philip Dane and at least 3 current circle members. Focus on those with culinary expertise. The food historian, the critic, the cookbook author. Artists sabotage other artists, Archie. Amateurs merely make mischief. I reached for my hat. And if our saboteur decides to escalate before Saturday? Wolfe's eyes were already closed, but his lips curved in what might have been a smile. Then we'll discover whether Marcel Frontenac's reputation can survive more than wounded pride. Because I suspect, before this is finished, someone is going to serve him something considerably more dangerous than the wrong wine. Philip Dane lived in a fourth-floor walk-up in the village that smelled like old coffee and newer disappointments. When he opened the door Thursday morning, I could see why Frontenac had enjoyed correcting him. He was 40-something, soft around the edges, with the defensive posture of a man who'd spent his career being told he wasn't quite good enough. "I don't have time for this," he said, not moving from the doorway. "Make time. Nero Wolfe is investigating the sabotage at Le Bernardin Noir, and your name keeps surfacing in interesting contexts." His face cycled through surprise, wariness, and resignation before settling on grudging curiosity. "Come in, then. But I've got nothing useful to tell you." His apartment was cramped but organized, shelves of cookbooks, wine guides, and back issues of food magazines. A man trying to build expertise on a shoestring budget. "You walked out of the July dinner calling Frontenac a pretentious fraud," I said, settling into his only decent chair. "Because he is." Dane poured himself coffee from a pot that had seen better decades. "Look, I write about food because I love it. I study it, research it, spend money I don't have on wines I can barely afford. And Frontenac treated me like an ignorant child every single dinner, correcting my observations, dismissing my questions, making sure everyone knew I was the amateur." "So you had motive for revenge?" "I had pride, Mr. Goodwin. There's a difference." He gestured at his cluttered desk. "After I left the circle, and I wrote a piece about culinary tyranny. It got picked up by 3 major sites. My readership tripled. Frontenac did me a favor." "Convenient. True, I don't need to sabotage Marcel Frontenac. The industry is already turning against chefs like him." He met my eyes directly. "But if you want a real suspect, talk to James Carmichael, the Times critic. Frontenac humiliated him publicly 2 dinners before July. Told him his palate was alarmingly conventional. Critics don't forget that kind of insult." I left Dane with his coffee and his theories, heading uptown to find the man with the alarming palate. James Carmichael lived in a pre-war on West End Avenue and had the rumpled dignity of serious food writing. He opened the door with a sigh that suggested he'd been expecting me. "If this is about Marcel's little difficulties, I'm happy to discuss them. Professional interest, you understand." His living room was lined with cookbooks and framed menus from restaurants that had achieved immortality through his reviews. He moved like a man whose joints remembered better days. "Dane says you've got a grudge against Frontenac." "Dane says many things, most of them bitter." Carmichael lowered himself into an armchair. "Marcel called my palate conventional, yes. It stung because it contained truth. But I'm a professional critic, Mr. Goodwin. I put my wounds into print, not into practical jokes." "You were there the night of the wine substitution." "Indeed. The bottle was opened at table. Correct label, proper cork, solid provenance. Paolo Ricci decanted it himself. When Marcel tasted it, he knew immediately something was wrong. Color too pale, nose too flat. A decent 2009 masquerading as a legendary 47. Anyone leave the table during earlier courses? The usual suspects, servers, Paolo, Nicole Beaumont, took a phone call. She's the cultural attaché. They live chained to their devices." He paused. "But here's what interests me professionally. Whoever's doing this understands Marcel's psychology intimately. They're not trying to destroy him outright. They're annotating him like a critic with access to the original manuscript." That was a disturbing thought. I thanked him and headed back downtown, but made one stop along the way. Patricia Vance lived in a brownstone that smelled like herbs and ambition. She was testing recipes in her kitchen and welcomed me with warm gougere that Fritz would have approved of. "The disturbances have everyone on edge," she said, wiping flour from her hands. "Especially the staff. I saw Marcel and Henri Ducasse arguing in the kitchen last month during the spice incident. Henri was shouting about being tired of cleaning up Marcel's messes. It sounded personal. Henri's the sous chef? Brilliant cook. But he's always been in Marcel's shadow. Sometimes talent without recognition breeds resentment. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk examining a small jar that sat on his blotter like evidence in a murder trial. "What's that?" I asked. "A message," Wolfe said grimly. "Delivered by messenger 20 minutes ago, from Frontenac." I picked up the jar labeled saffron, Spanish grade A. It looked normal until I opened it and poured the contents onto paper. Mixed with the precious red threads were tiny fragments of something that caught the light. "Eggshell," Wolfe said. "Ground fine and mixed with the saffron. Harmless but effective. It would destroy any dish's texture and make Marcel appear careless with his most expensive ingredient." "So our saboteur has escalated again." "Precisely, and gained access to the spice storage, which narrows our field considerably." Wolfe leaned back. "Frontenac arrives in 15 minutes. I want to hear his account of these people before we proceed. Because someone has decided that destroying a chef's reputation is more satisfying than simply eating his food." The phone rang as if on cue. I picked up the phone. "Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin." "Mr. Goodwin." Frontenac's voice was tight as a violin string about to snap. "I am 3 blocks away. But I must tell you, Henri Ducasse has quit this morning. He said he could no longer work under these conditions of suspicion and paranoia." I covered the mouthpiece and relayed this to Wolfe, whose eyebrows climbed exactly 1/8 of an inch, his equivalent of jumping out of his chair. "Tell him to come directly," Wolfe said. When the doorbell rang 12 minutes later, I opened it to find a man who looked like he'd been fighting a losing battle with his own reputation. Marcel Frontenac was shorter than I'd expected, maybe 5'8", with the compact build of someone who'd spent decades orchestrating controlled chaos in professional kitchens. His hands moved constantly, adjusting his coat, checking his watch, reaching for objects that weren't there. He followed me into the office carrying a leather portfolio like it contained nuclear secrets. The Wolfe studied him with the attention he reserves for orchids showing signs of disease. "Mr. Frontenac, sit. The contaminated saffron. When exactly did you discover it?" Frontenac perched on the edge of the red leather chair. "This morning, during prep for Saturday. The moment I opened the jar, I knew. Someone had mixed crushed eggshell throughout the threads. Harmless, but devastating. It would destroy any dish's texture completely." "Who has access to your spice cabinet?" "Only 3 people have keys. Myself, Henri, and Paolo Ricci, my sommelier." His jaw tightened. "The cabinet is always locked. The key never leaves my person except when I give it to Henri for mise en place." "Yet Henri has quit," I observed. "Convenient timing." Henri was angry, yes. He accused me of creating an atmosphere of paranoia, of treating him like an amateur. But Henri would never... He stopped, realizing what he'd been about to say. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about your circle members. Not their qualifications, their resentments. Who among them most desires to be what you are rather than merely consume what you create?" Frontenac shifted uncomfortably. "Patricia Vance asked me to collaborate on her next cookbook 4 months ago. I declined. She took it as a professional rejection rather than a protection of my methods. James Carmichael resents my corrections of his palate, but continues attending because the Times expects coverage. Thomas Brennan sees me as competition for New York expansion." "When did Miss Vance make this request?" "Early July, just before the incidents began." The implications settled on him like a heavy sauce. "But Patricia would never..." She understands food, respects the craft. She also understands exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage, Wolfe said. Wine substitution, spice contamination, menu theft, each targets a different aspect of your artistry. That suggests intimate knowledge of your process. Frontenac opened his portfolio and withdrew a cream-colored card. This was slipped under my office door this morning. He handed it to Wolfe with trembling fingers. It was a menu card for Saturday's dinner, beautifully printed in elegant script, Le Dîner des Ombres, the Dinner of Shadows. 7 courses exploring different aspects of darkness. Black truffle velouté, squid ink pasta, charred leek ash, Osetra caviar. But across the bottom, someone had written in red ink, "The final course will be served cold." Wolfe examined it without expression. Melodramatic, but specific. Your final savory course? Venison with black cherry reduction, served at exactly 58 degrees Celsius. Any colder, the sauce congeals into paste. Frontenac's voice was barely above a whisper. They know exactly how to destroy 6 months of preparation. Then we shall prevent them. Wolfe handed the card back. You will proceed with Saturday's dinner exactly as planned. Change nothing. Act as though you have not consulted us. But you will purchase fresh spices from a different supplier and store them in a location known only to yourself. And if they strike during service, they will not. The pattern suggests someone who works from shadows, not spotlights. Saturday is meant to be their masterpiece of humiliation, not a crude assault. Wolfe's tone was final. Archie will call Saul Panzer for surveillance of your establishment. And if someone intends to sabotage your preparation, they must gain access first. After Frontenac left, looking marginally less desperate but no less terrified, I reached for the phone. Saul, Wolfe has a job. High-end restaurant surveillance on East 62nd. We need eyes on anyone who doesn't belong, or anyone who belongs but acts like they shouldn't. When do you want me there? Now. And Saul, watch the service entrance particularly. Someone's been playing with keys. Wolfe rang for beer, settling back in his chair with the expression of a man who'd identified the enemy's position. You think it's Vance? I asked. I think, Wolfe said carefully, we are dealing with someone whose professional ego has been wounded by proximity to genius. The contaminated saffron tells us they are running out of patience. And impatient people make mistakes we can exploit. The phone rang at 9:40 that evening. Saul's voice was crisp and alert. Archie. Movement at the service entrance. Paolo Ricci just let himself in with a woman. Tall, dark hair, expensive coat. Looks like the cultural attaché from your list. Nicole Beaumont. They're inside now, and they definitely didn't want to be seen. I looked at Wolfe, whose eyes had opened fully for the first time all day. Go, he said. Observe, but do not intervene unless they attempt to damage property. I want to know what a sommelier and a diplomat are doing in a darkened kitchen 2 nights before a masterpiece. If there's one thing you learn working for Nero Wolfe, it's that when suspicious people do suspicious things in the dark, so they're usually up to something more interesting than comparing wine notes. I was reaching for my coat before Wolfe finished speaking. Keep the line open, I told Saul. I'll be there in 20 minutes. If they start grinding eggshells into anything, you whistle, Dixie. Right, Saul said dryly. Nothing says covert surveillance like a man whistling show tunes in an alley. The cab dropped me 3 blocks from Le Bernardin Noir, and I covered the distance on foot, staying in the shadows. Saul was positioned across the street in a recessed doorway that gave him clear sight lines to both entrances. The restaurant's front was dark except for security lighting, but there was a dim glow coming from the basement-level windows. They've been inside 22 minutes, Saul murmured as I joined him. Went straight to the service entrance with a key. No hesitation, no looking around. They belong there, or they're very good at pretending they do. I studied the building. Le Bernardin Noir occupied a converted townhouse with a kind of understated elegance that whispers money instead of shouting it. The basement windows were narrow, but gave me an angle into what had to be the wine cellar. "I'm going closer," I said. "Keep watching the exits." I crossed the street and worked my way along the building's side until I found a window that offered a clear view into the cellar. What I saw made the evening considerably more interesting than I'd bargained for. Paolo Ricci stood at a wine rack, tall and elegant in his shirt sleeves, holding a bottle up to the light with the reverence most people reserve for religious artifacts. Now Nicole Beaumont watched him from 3 feet away, her expensive coat still buttoned, her expression sharp with concentration. But she wasn't watching him examine wine. She was watching him like a supervisor checking quality control. Paolo set down the first bottle and selected another from a higher shelf, climbing a small ladder with careful precision. When he descended, he was cradling the bottle like it contained liquid gold. They spoke in low voices. I couldn't make out words, but the body language told a clear story. She asked a question. He nodded. She checked her watch. Then Paolo did something that transformed my evening from routine surveillance into active investigation. He reached inside his coat and produced another bottle. Same shape, same dark glass, but clearly not from Frontenac's cellar. He compared the labels with meticulous care, made some adjustment I couldn't see clearly, then placed his bottle on the rack where the other had been. The original disappeared back into his coat. Nicole said something brief and pointed. Paolo locked the wine room door with obvious care, and they moved toward the service stairs. I had maybe 40 seconds to get back to Saul before they emerged. I made it with 15 seconds to spare. We watched them exit together, Paolo checking the lock twice, Nicole already on her phone. At the corner, they separated without any obvious affection, just 2 people who'd completed a business transaction. "Well?" Saul asked quietly. "Wine substitution, live and direct. Paolo just switched bottles in Frontenac's private cellar. Us and our French diplomat was supervising the operation like a quality control inspector. Think they spotted us? No, but they're not amateurs. This looked like a practiced routine, not a first-time adventure." I pulled out my phone. "Stay on them separately. I need to know where they go and who they see. If Paolo comes back alone, call me immediately." I dialed the brownstone. Fritz answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he uses when Wolfe is in a mood. "Archie, Mr. Wolfe is reading, but he said if you called with developments, get him, this won't wait." 30 seconds of silence, then Wolfe's voice, carrying the slight irritation of a man pulled from a comfortable chair. "Yes?" I gave him the complete picture. Paolo's careful substitution, Nicole's supervisory role, showed the practiced efficiency of 2 people who'd clearly done this before. "Fascinating," Wolfe said, and I could practically hear his brain shifting into high gear. "The sommelier has access, expertise, and opportunity. But why would he sabotage his own reputation? When wine fails at table, the sommelier shares the blame with the chef, unless he's being paid enough not to care about his reputation, or unless he plans to blame someone else entirely. Or," Wolfe said slowly, his voice taking on the tone he uses when pieces start falling into place, "unless he intends to discover the substitution himself during Saturday's service. Consider this scenario. Paolo dramatically reveals a switched bottle during the dinner, proving that someone has infiltrated Frontenac's supposedly secure cellar. He becomes the hero who saved the evening, and while Frontenac's security protocols are exposed as inadequate. That's pretty elaborate for a wine steward. Everything about this case has been elaborate, Archie. But such a plan requires a collaborator with both motive and means. Someone who benefits from Frontenac's diminished authority without wanting his complete destruction. The cultural attaché fits that profile. Precisely. Nicole Beaumont has diplomatic immunity, social connections, and a professional interest in French culinary reputation. She could facilitate arrangements that others cannot. Wolfe paused, thinking, where is the original bottle now? inside Paolo's coat, heading east on 62nd Street with whatever secrets it contains. Then we need to know what those secrets are, and quickly. Because if Paolo removed what Frontenac planned to serve Saturday, whatever he replaced it with is designed either to humiliate or to harm, and given the escalating pattern, I suspect the latter. The way he said harm made my spine straighten. You think this has moved beyond pranks? I think someone has spent 3 months establishing a pattern of non-lethal mischief specifically so Saturday's incident will be dismissed as more of the same, until it's too late to prevent genuine damage. Wolfe's voice carried the weight of certainty. Find out what's in that bottle, Archie. Tonight, if possible. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with before Saturday's curtain rises. The phone buzzed as I hung up. Saul's voice was crisp with professional interest. Paolo's heading to the Upper West Side. Looks residential. But here's the interesting part. Nicole just entered the Carlisle Hotel, as she's having what appears to be a very intense conversation with Thomas Brennan in the lobby bar, the restaurant owner from Boston who's been trying to expand into New York. How intense? The kind where people lean forward and keep their voices low. Money and secrets, if I had to guess. I felt pieces clicking together like tumblers in a very expensive lock. Stay on Brennan and Beaumont. I'm going to pay Paolo a house call, the kind where we discuss his wine collection before he realizes he needs a lawyer. Want backup? Not yet, but keep your phone close. If Paolo's working for Brennan, this just became about business competition and market territory. And people do considerably stupider things for those motivations than they ever do for wounded artistic pride. Friday morning arrived gray and purposeful, carrying the weight of a story approaching its climax. I spent the early hours tracking down Paolo Ricci's apartment in Astoria, a modest place that suggested either financial restraint or careful money management. When I knocked on his door at 9:15, he answered wearing yesterday's clothes and the expression of a man who'd been expecting bad news. Mr. Goodwin. His accent was thicker than it had been at the restaurant, stress peeling away his professional polish. I suppose you want to discuss last evening. Among other things. May I come in? He stepped aside reluctantly, and I entered a small apartment that was obsessively organized. Cookbooks arranged by cuisine, wine guides sorted by region, everything in its designated place. The kind of precision that comes from a lifetime of working in professional kitchens. The bottle you removed from Frontenac's cellar, I said without preamble. What was it, and where is it now? Paolo's shoulders sagged slightly. A 1982 Bordeaux, Chateau Latour. Marcel planned it for the final wine course Saturday night. And you replaced it with? A 1983 Latour from the same vineyard. Excellent wine, but not the vintage Marcel selected. The difference would be subtle but noticeable to an expert palate. Why? Paolo moved to his small kitchen and poured coffee with hands that weren't entirely steady. Because Thomas Brennan offered me $50,000 to ensure Marcel's dinner was memorable for the wrong reasons. Not ruined, just flawed enough to raise questions about his judgment. And Nicole Beaumont's role? Diplomatic cover. If questions arise about access to the restaurant, she can claim cultural ministry business. She also has connections to food critics and industry publications. He met my eyes directly. I'm not proud of this, Mr. Goodwin, but I've been Paolo the sommelier for 15 years, always in someone else's shadow. Brennan offered me a chance to open my own place in Boston, to be more than Marcel's wine servant. Where's the original bottle now? Safe. I plan to return it after Saturday, claim I discovered the substitution during service, make myself the hero while raising doubts about Marcel's security procedures. I left Paolo's apartment with more answers than I'd expected, but fewer than I needed. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk examining what appeared to be restaurant financial records spread across his blotter. Saul delivered these an hour ago, he said without looking up. Thomas Brennan's expansion plans for New York. Quite illuminating. I gave him the complete report on Paolo's confession. Wolfe listened without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer as the pieces assembled. "So," he said when I finished, "a business conspiracy disguised as artistic sabotage. Brennan eliminates his primary competition by purchasing the loyalty of Frontenac's key staff member. Elegant in its simplicity. But not complete," I pointed out. "Paolo was only handling the wine substitution. Someone else did the spice contamination and menu theft." "Indeed. Which suggests either multiple conspirators or a separate agenda entirely." Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "Call Frontenac. Tell him his sommelier has been compromised, but not to dismiss him yet. And we want Paolo at Saturday's dinner, where his planned revelation will serve our purposes instead of Brennan's. And if there's another saboteur we haven't identified." Wolfe's eyes opened fully, carrying the gleam of a hunter who'd finally spotted his quarry. "Then tomorrow evening will be even more interesting than I anticipated, because someone who spent 3 months orchestrating Marcel Frontenac's professional humiliation will not be content to let Thomas Brennan claim credit for the finale." The way he said it made me reach for the phone a little faster than usual. In my experience, when Nero Wolfe starts talking about finales, somebody's evening is about to become considerably more complicated than they'd planned. If you've never told a world-class chef that his trusted sommelier has sold him out for 50 grand in a restaurant in Boston, you haven't lived a full life. You also haven't watched a man whose art depends on control try not to explode when everything he's built starts crumbling around his saucepans. Frontenac sat bolt upright in Wolfe's office chair, his hands gripping the arm so tight his knuckles went white. I'd finished the condensed version of Paolo's confession and Brennan's role, and for a moment I thought he was going to get up and start rearranging the furniture with his bare hands. "He admitted this," Frontenac demanded, his accent thickening to the point you could pour it over pancakes. "To you, freely?" "With garnish," I said, though he did add some remorse for seasoning, saying that might have been for his own benefit. Frontenac looked like someone had seasoned his soul with ground glass. "And you suggest I keep him at my table for the most important dinner of my career?" Wolfe, who had been letting me handle the emotional heavy lifting, intervened with his usual diplomatic subtlety. "You will keep him because he is more useful to you compromised than dismissed. If you fire him now, Mr. Brennan will know his scheme has been exposed and will adapt accordingly. I prefer that he not have that opportunity. But Paolo will serve poisoned wine to my guests. Paolo will serve exactly what I tell him to serve," Wolfe said firmly. "He will return the original bottle before service and make his planned revelation at the precise moment I require. That it will create a distraction when we need one most." Frontenac swallowed hard. "You think the real attack will come during this distraction?" "I think," Wolfe replied, his tone carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "that someone whose sabotage has been escalating in both sophistication and malice will not waste their finale on a simple vintage substitution. That was Brennan's plan, crude commercial warfare. Our other saboteur has been orchestrating something far more elaborate." The pieces were clicking together in Wolfe's mind like tumblers in a very expensive lock. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed in the expression that means his brain is working at full capacity. "Consider the pattern, Archie. Wine substitution, spice contamination, menu theft, each incident more theatrical than the last, each designed not merely to embarrass, but to build a narrative. Someone has been constructing a story over 3 months, with Marcel as the protagonist, whose fall from grace becomes increasingly inevitable." "You're thinking like a writer," I said. "Precisely. Because we are dealing with a writer. Someone who understands how to craft suspense, escalate tension, and deliver a spectacular climax. Someone with enough culinary knowledge to be credible, enough distance to operate without suspicion, and enough wounded pride to sustain a 3-month campaign of revenge." Frontenac was staring at us like we were speaking in code. "Who?" "Philip Dane," Wolfe said with satisfaction. The food writer who stormed out of your July dinner calling you a pretentious fraud. To the man who has spent the subsequent months building his reputation on articles about culinary tyranny and chef arrogance, using your supposed failings as his primary source material. I felt that familiar tingle you get when puzzle pieces start forming a picture. He leaves the circle in a dramatic exit, gains distance and moral authority, then begins systematically proving his point about your character by creating the evidence himself. Exactly. Each incident becomes material for his crusade against culinary despotism. The wine substitution gives him a story about your careless cellar management. The spice contamination proves your kitchen lacks proper security. The stolen menu demonstrates your paranoid secrecy. Wolfe's eyes opened fully. But a writer needs a proper ending, Archie. And endings require consequences more serious than embarrassment. The way he said consequences made me reach for my notebook. You think he's planning something dangerous for Saturday? I think he's spent 3 months establishing a pattern of harmless mischief. Precisely so. Saturday's incident will be dismissed as more of the same, until it's too late to prevent genuine harm. Wolfe looked directly at Frontenac. What is your most vulnerable course tomorrow evening? The venison, Frontenac said immediately. It requires precise temperature control, exact timing, and the sauce must be prepared hours in advance. If anything goes wrong with that course, the entire evening fails. Then that is where he will strike. Not during service, but during preparation. Something that will cause dramatic, visible failure in front of your most influential guests. Wolfe paused. Or something that will cause illness serious enough to require medical attention. Nothing fatal. Dane is not a killer, but spectacular enough to destroy your reputation permanently. I stood up. I'll find him, see what he's been up to and where he plans to be Saturday. No need, Wolfe said. He will be there tomorrow evening, not as a guest, but as an observer. Writers attend their own premieres, Archie. The question is whether he'll be in the dining room watching his revenge unfold, or in the kitchen ensuring it succeeds. Frontenac had gone pale. What do you want me to do? Prepare for Saturday exactly as planned, but with modifications. Purchase entirely fresh ingredients for the venison course from sources Dane cannot access. Prepare the sauce in a location he cannot reach. And most importantly, Wolfe's voice carried the authority of a general issuing battle orders. Follow my instructions precisely during the dinner service. You're not merely cooking tomorrow evening, Marcel. You are performing in a drama where the villain believes he has written the ending. After Frontenac left, looking like a man who'd been handed both a death sentence and a reprieve, I turned to Wolfe. You really think Dane will show up tomorrow night? I think Philip Dane has spent 3 months crafting the perfect story of culinary hubris and its consequences. He will not miss the climax. Wolfe reached for his beer, and neither will we. Because tomorrow evening, we will demonstrate that the only thing more satisfying than a perfectly prepared meal is watching a perfectly prepared criminal discover that someone has been rewriting his script. Saturday arrived dressed in the kind of crisp expectation that usually precedes either triumph or disaster. By 7:30, I was in black tie, feeling marginally more civilized than usual, while Wolfe emerged from his room looking like a mountain range that had been forced into formal wear. The car is waiting, I told him. Saul's already in position, Frontenac knows the plan, and Paolo still thinks he's running his own game. Wolfe grunted, settling his hat with the precision of a man preparing for battle. Then let us discover whether Philip Dane's appetite for revenge has exceeded his talent for execution. Because if I am correct about his intentions, tonight's dinner will be considerably more memorable than anyone expects, including Mr. Dane himself. The way he said it made me check my watch and reach for the door a little faster than usual. In my experience, when Nero Wolfe starts talking about memorable dinners, somebody's evening is about to become a lot more complicated than they'd planned. Le Bernardin Noir at 8 o'clock on Saturday evening was the kind of place that makes you understand why people commit felonies for reservations. The dining room occupied what had once been a private library. intimate without being cramped, elegant without shouting about it. Crystal caught candlelight, silver gleamed against white linen, and the air carried the subtle perfume of serious money being seriously spent. Wolfe and I were positioned midway down the single long table that dominated the room, giving us clear sight lines to both the kitchen entrance and the assembled guests. The seating arrangement had been carefully orchestrated. Wolfe's request, naturally, placing us where we could observe without appearing to dominate. The circle of Epicurus was assembling with the measured precision of a diplomatic reception. Dr. Sylvia Chen was discussing Song Dynasty banquet protocols with Father Keating, who listened with the attention of a man who'd found theology in his soup course. James Carmichael examined the evening's wine list with the expression of a critic expecting to be disappointed. Patricia Vance chatted warmly with Richard Ashford about his latest Burgundy acquisition, while Thomas Brennan surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd already won the evening's most important game. Nicole Beaumont entered precisely at 8, elegant in black silk, her diplomatic smile firmly in place as she greeted fellow guests. But I caught her eyes flicking toward the kitchen entrance twice in 30 seconds. Nervous energy poorly concealed behind professional polish. Paolo Ricci appeared moments later to present the wine selections, his voice steady despite knowing that Wolfe and I understood exactly what he'd planned. To his credit, he maintained absolute professional composure, describing each vintage with genuine reverence for wines he'd been paid to betray. But the person I was most interested in didn't appear among the seated guests, and Philip Dane had positioned himself near the service entrance, notebook in hand, with the expression of a critic attending a performance he'd written himself. Wolfe had been right. Authors always attend their own premieres. Frontenac emerged from the kitchen at 8:15, his chef's whites immaculate, his composure absolute. If he was terrified about what the evening might bring, he buried it under decades of professional discipline. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Le Dîner des Ombres. Tonight, we explore the intersection of darkness and flavor, beginning with black truffle velouté accompanied by toasted brioche. The first course arrived with theatrical precision. Small porcelain cups containing liquid darkness, each portion a study in controlled indulgence. The room fell silent as 12 people tasted simultaneously, and I watched faces transform from polite expectation to genuine surprise. Whatever else was happening tonight, Frontenac's artistry was legitimate. The meal progressed with clockwork precision through the second and third courses, squid ink pasta with sea urchin, then charred leek ash with smoked eel and ossetra caviar. Paolo presented wines with appropriate ceremony, and Wolfe tasted each pairing with the concentration of a man cataloguing evidence for future reference. But I could feel the tension building like steam in a covered pot. During the fourth course, Patricia Vance leaned toward Carmichael, whispering with unusual urgency. Brennan had his phone out beneath the table, typing messages with the intensity of a man coordinating military movements. And Nicole Beaumont was staring at her wine glass as though it contained something considerably more complex than Montrachet. The fifth and sixth courses passed without visible incident. Roasted pigeon with black garlic, followed by aged cheeses with honeycomb. Each dish was flawless, each wine perfectly matched. But Wolfe's attention wasn't on the food. He was watching the room like a conductor waiting for his orchestra to reach the crescendo. At 10:15, servers began emerging from the kitchen carrying the evening's centerpiece, the venison course that represented Frontenac's artistic pinnacle. Silver cloches covered each plate, maintaining the precise temperature that would make or break the dish's success. The room's conversation dropped to reverent whispers. Frontenac appeared in the dining room doorway, his face pale but determined. He surveyed his assembled guests, then nodded to the servers positioned behind each chair. Ladies and gentlemen, venison loin prepared at precisely 58 degrees Celsius with black cherry reduction and cocoa nibs. The wine is a 1982 Chateau Latour, selected for its structure and complexity. Paolo stepped forward with the bottle, presenting it to Frontenac for inspection. The label was correct, the seal unbroken, the provenance impeccable. Frontenac nodded approval. That's when Wolfe's voice cut through the room's hushed anticipation like a blade through silk. "Stop!" It wasn't shouted. Wolfe doesn't shout, but it carried enough authority to freeze every hand in the room. 12 guests turned toward our table with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. "Mr. Wolfe," Carmichael sputtered. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" "A necessary intervention," Wolfe replied calmly, his bulk settling more firmly into his chair. "Before anyone lifts those covers, there is a matter of composition to discuss, specifically regarding the sauce." Frontenac moved toward our table, playing his assigned role perfectly. "The sauce, Mr. Wolfe?" "The black cherry reduction prepared this afternoon in your main kitchen. I believe Mr. Dane has taken particular interest in its final ingredients." All eyes shifted to Philip Dane, who was standing near the service entrance looking suddenly exposed. He tried to maintain his air of journalistic detachment, but color was draining from his face like wine from a broken glass. "I don't know what you're suggesting," Dane said, his voice tight with controlled panic. I'm merely here as an observer." "An observer who creates his own news," Wolfe countered. His gaze shifted to the kitchen doorway where Saul Panzer appeared, holding a small plastic bottle in an evidence bag. "Found it exactly where you predicted," Saul announced clearly. "Taped under the prep station cooling rack. Empty now, but the residue should prove illuminating." Wolfe's voice carried to every corner of the room. "Ipecac syrup, a powerful emetic, tasteless when mixed with rich reduction, but devastating in its effects. Had those covers been lifted and that sauce consumed, every guest here would have become violently ill within 20 minutes. A spectacular finale to Mr. Dane's 3-month narrative of culinary incompetence." The silence was absolute. You could have heard a souffle collapse. That's completely absurd," Dane stammered, taking a step backward. "You have no proof. We have better than proof," Wolfe interrupted. "We have method, opportunity, and documentation. You gained access to the kitchen at 4:15 this afternoon, ostensibly to interview staff. Security footage shows you lingering near the sauce cooling station while the kitchen was distracted by a delivery you arranged." Dane's face cycled through denial, calculation, and resignation. But Wolfe wasn't finished. "However, Mr. Dane's sabotage has failed for a simple reason. The sauce beneath those covers is not the sauce he contaminated. Mr. Frontenac prepared fresh reduction 2 hours ago using ingredients purchased this morning from a different supplier." Relief rippled through the room like a physical wave. But Wolfe's attention had already shifted. "We are not quite finished with tonight's deceptions. Mr. Ricci, I believe you have something to discuss with Mr. Brennan regarding that Chateau Latour." Paolo Ricci froze, the bottle trembling slightly in his hands. He looked at Brennan, then at Wolfe, then at Frontenac. The weight of his decision hung in the air for a long moment. Then he straightened his shoulders and walked deliberately to Thomas Brennan's chair. "This is the 1982 Latour you paid me $50,000 to replace with inferior wine," Paolo said, his voice carrying clearly. "I am returning it to proper service, and I am returning your money." He pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it deliberately on Brennan's plate. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Brennan's face went purple with rage and embarrassment. Carmichael was already taking notes with the fervor of a man witnessing the story of the year. Wolfe sat back in his chair, satisfaction evident in his slight smile. He had orchestrated the evening's chaos perfectly, transforming potential disaster into theater of justice. "Now then," Wolfe said, his voice cutting through the commotion with final authority. "Mr. Frontenac, I believe your guests are waiting. The venison is getting cold. and it would be a shame to waste such artistry on anything less than perfect timing. Frontenac nodded, his relief and gratitude evident as he signaled the servers. The covers lifted simultaneously, revealing the evening's masterpiece, exactly as it should be served. But as the guests began to eat, I noticed Wolfe wasn't touching his plate. His eyes were still moving around the room, cataloguing faces and reactions with the methodical attention of a man who knew the evening's final act was yet to come. Because in my experience, when Nero Wolfe starts talking about perfect timing, somebody's about to discover that their carefully laid plans have been rewritten by a master of the craft. The venison was perfection. Tender meat meeting the precise temperature that separates artistry from mere cooking. The black cherry reduction providing dark sweetness without overwhelming the game's natural flavor. Around the table, 11 people ate with the focused attention of those who'd just witnessed theater and weren't entirely certain the curtain had fallen. But Wolfe wasn't eating. He sat motionless, his hands folded, watching the room with the intensity of a conductor waiting for his orchestra to reach the final movement. So I followed his gaze and understood why. The evening's revelations had exposed the obvious players: Dane's sabotage, Brennan's commercial conspiracy, Paolo's purchased betrayal, but something in the room's dynamics still felt unresolved. Philip Dane had been escorted out by Saul, his notebook clutched like a life preserver in a storm he'd helped create. Thomas Brennan sat in furious silence, his bribery envelope untouched beside his plate like evidence he couldn't make disappear. But the person who held Wolfe's attention was Nicole Beaumont, who had grown increasingly still as the evening progressed. She was cutting her venison with mechanical precision, each piece exactly the same size, her diplomatic composure intact, but brittle around the edges. When James Carmichael leaned toward her to comment on the wine pairing, she responded with the kind of smile that diplomats use when they're buying time to think. Wolfe set down his fork with deliberate finality. The sound carried enough authority to quiet the table's murmured conversations. "Before we proceed to the final course," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "there remains one matter requiring clarification. We have identified the saboteur and the commercial conspirator, but we have not yet addressed the coordinator." Dr. Chen looked puzzled. "Coordinator, Mr. Wolfe?" "The person who ensured that Mr. Dane's campaign of mischief and Mr. Brennan's wine substitution would culminate simultaneously tonight. 3 months of escalating incidents do not organize themselves, nor do separate conspiracies naturally synchronize without assistance." Every eye in the room was now fixed on Wolfe, but his attention remained focused on Nicole Beaumont, who had stopped cutting her meat entirely. "Consider the logistics," Wolfe continued methodically. "Mr. Dane required kitchen schedules, delivery times, staff rotations, information unavailable to a casual observer. Mr. Brennan needed introduction to a sommelier vulnerable to corruption, along with detailed knowledge of wine storage and service protocols. Neither man possessed these resources independently." "Are you suggesting they had an accomplice?" Patricia Vance asked, her notebook forgotten in her lap. "I'm stating it as fact," Wolfe replied. "Someone with legitimate access to Le Bernardin Noir provided both men with the intelligence they required." And Nicole Beaumont finally looked up from her plate, meeting Wolfe's gaze with the steady composure of someone trained in international negotiation. "That's an interesting theory, Mr. Wolfe. Do you have evidence to support it?" "I have method, opportunity, and motive," Wolfe said calmly. "Your position as cultural attaché gives you oversight responsibilities for French culinary establishments in New York. You have conducted multiple cultural assessments of Le Bernardin Noir, gaining access to kitchen operations, staff schedules, and security protocols. You know exactly when deliveries arrive, when the kitchen is vulnerable, and which staff members might be susceptible to outside influence." The room had gone absolutely silent. Even the servers had stopped moving. "Furthermore," Wolfe continued, Your diplomatic status allowed you to facilitate introductions between parties who might not otherwise meet, such as a Boston restaurateur seeking New York expansion and a sommelier with expensive tastes and modest salary. Nicole's composure remained intact, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. Even if such meetings occurred, they would be within my legitimate cultural promotion duties. Indeed, which provided perfect cover for coordination that served your own agenda. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. You did not want Mr. Frontenac destroyed. You wanted him dependent. A chef whose security had been compromised, whose judgment had been questioned, and whose reputation required rehabilitation would naturally turn to official French cultural authorities for support and validation. That's entirely speculative, Nicole said, but her voice had lost some of its diplomatic warmth. Is it? Wolfe's tone sharpened. You provided Mr. Dane with the kitchen access codes that allowed his afternoon intrusion. You arranged the meeting between Mr. Brennan and Paolo Ricci at the Carlisle Hotel. You even suggested the timing, ensuring both schemes would culminate at tonight's dinner, creating maximum impact while maintaining your own plausible deniability. Frontenac stepped forward from the kitchen doorway, his face pale with understanding. Nicole, is this true? She looked at him with something approaching regret. Marcel, your artistry is unquestionable, but your business judgment is naive. You refuse ministry guidance, reject cultural oversight, operate as though French cuisine in America needs no official coordination. I simply wanted to demonstrate that even the most talented chef requires proper institutional support. By orchestrating attacks on my reputation, by creating circumstances that would make you receptive to collaboration rather than suspicious of it. She stood gracefully, her diplomatic training reasserting itself. Nothing I did was illegal, Mr. Wolfe. Facilitating business introductions and providing cultural information are within my official duties. Perhaps, Wolfe conceded, but conspiracy to commit commercial sabotage and failure to report knowledge of food tampering are not. Mr. Carmichael has been documenting this conversation for tomorrow's Times. Does your ministry will find your methods diplomatically embarrassing. Nicole Beaumont looked around the table, seeing accusation and disappointment in faces that had been her colleagues and companions. Her carefully constructed network of influence was crumbling in real time. If you'll excuse me, she said with whatever dignity remained to her, I believe I have urgent communications to make with Paris. She walked toward the exit with measured steps, her diplomatic immunity protecting her from prosecution, but not from consequences. Wolfe watched her go, then turned his attention to Frontenac, who stood in the kitchen doorway looking like a man who'd discovered poison in his own pantry. The damage can be contained, Wolfe said matter-of-factly. Mr. Dane's career is finished. Mr. Brennan's reputation is ruined. And Madame Beaumont's influence is neutralized. Your circle may be smaller, but it will be composed entirely of people who attend for the correct reasons. He picked up his fork and took a bite of the now cooling venison. The reduction is exceptional. The balance between sweet and savory demonstrates genuine understanding of flavor architecture. It would be a shame to let such artistry grow cold while dwelling on the machinations of those who mistake manipulation for sophistication. Frontenac nodded slowly, relief and exhaustion warring in his expression. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Though I fear this evening has taught me that even the most carefully controlled kitchen can be infiltrated by those with sufficient patience and malice. Indeed, Wolfe agreed, setting down his fork with satisfaction, which is why the finest chefs, like the finest detectives, must remain perpetually vigilant. Excellence attracts both admirers and enemies, Mr. Frontenac. The key is ensuring that the former outnumber the latter at your table. He gestured toward the remaining guests, who were beginning to resume their conversations with the tentative relief of people who'd survived a storm. Now then, I believe you mentioned a final course. After such an eventful evening, something sweet would be most welcome. As Frontenac returned to his kitchen with renewed purpose, I reflected that in the world of Nero Wolfe, justice served properly is almost as satisfying as a perfectly prepared meal. Almost, but not quite, because unlike justice, a good dinner never leaves a bitter aftertaste. And the final course arrived with a theatrical precision that transforms dessert into philosophy. Dark chocolate soufflé infused with Valrhona chocolate and black cardamom, each portion risen to exactly the correct height, the surface bearing a subtle sheen that suggested hours of temperature calibration. Frontenac himself delivered Wolfe's portion, his hands finally steady. Valrhona chocolate with black cardamom and sea salt, he announced. The pairing is a 1963 Banyuls, chosen for its ability to complement without overwhelming. Wolfe examined the soufflé with the attention most people reserve for signed documents. He broke the surface with his spoon, releasing steam that carried the complex aroma of chocolate tempered by spice. The first bite was consumed in absolute silence, his expression cycling through evaluation, appreciation, and something approaching contentment. "Extraordinary," he said finally. The cardamom provides exactly the right counterpoint to the chocolate's richness, while the salt prevents the sweetness from becoming cloying. This is not merely dessert, Mr. Frontenac. This is an argument about balance presented in edible form. Around the table, the remaining guests, now numbering 9 after the evening's various departures, ate with renewed appreciation. James Carmichael was already composing his review mentally, his notebook filled with observations that would fuel articles for months. Patricia Vance discussed the soufflé's texture with Dr. Chen, their earlier suspicions replaced by professional appreciation. Even Richard Ashford, who'd spent most of the evening focused on wine rather than drama. She looked energized by the evening's unexpected theater. Dr. Sylvia Chen leaned toward Wolfe as coffee was being served. "Mr. Wolfe, when did you realize that Madame Beaumont was coordinating the separate conspiracies?" "When Mr. Goodwin reported her presence at Paolo's wine substitution," Wolfe replied, accepting his coffee with a nod to the server. A cultural attaché supervising a sommelier's private activities suggested either romantic involvement or professional coordination. Given her subsequent meeting with Mr. Brennan, the latter became obvious. Frontenac, who had joined the table after ensuring his kitchen staff received proper recognition, looked exhausted but vindicated. "Though I confess, Mr. Wolfe, I'm uncertain how to proceed from here. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild." "Then do not rebuild it," Wolfe said bluntly. "Create something new. Your circle began as an experiment in shared appreciation. Let tonight's events transform it into something more resilient, a gathering of people who have witnessed both your artistry and your vulnerability, and who choose to return regardless." He gestured toward the remaining guests. "These 9 people stayed through scandal and revelation. They ate your venison, knowing it had been targeted for sabotage. They consumed your soufflé after watching 3 conspiracies unravel at your table. That demonstrates commitment beyond mere appetite, Mr. Frontenac. Value it accordingly." By 11:30, we were in the car heading back to the brownstone. Wolfe sat in the back seat with his eyes closed. His bulk settled into the upholstery with the finality of a mountain returning to rest. "Satisfactory evening?" I asked. "Adequate," he said, which from Wolfe constituted high praise. The venison was exceptional, the soufflé demonstrated genuine mastery, and justice was served with appropriate timing. "You knew Dane had contaminated the sauce, but you let Frontenac serve the dinner anyway. What if you'd been wrong about which batch was safe?" Wolfe's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "I was not wrong. I verified the preparation personally during our 4 o'clock reconnaissance. Mr. Frontenac prepared 2 batches, one in the main kitchen where Dane had access, one in his private preparation area using ingredients purchased that morning. The contaminated sauce was disposed of before service began. You might have mentioned that. And diminished the evening's dramatic impact. Theater requires uncertainty, Archie. The audience must believe genuine stakes exist, or the performance loses its power to convince. We entered the brownstone to find Fritz waiting with brandy and the satisfied expression of a man who'd monitored the evening's progress through periodic updates. The house felt solid and welcoming, a fortress against the unpredictable world. "Successful resolution?" Fritz asked, pouring generous measures into crystal snifters. "Complete," Wolfe confirmed, settling into his chair with the relief of a man returning to his natural habitat. "Though I confess I am grateful to be home. Dining out, however exceptional the cuisine, it lacks the comfort of familiar surroundings and trusted company." He raised his glass in a small salute. "To Marcel Frontenac, who learned tonight that excellence attracts both admirers and enemies, and to the principle that the finest defense against mediocrity's envy is not paranoia, but continued dedication to one's craft." We drank to that, and I reflected that Wolfe had orchestrated the entire evening like a conductor leading an orchestra through a complex symphony, knowing exactly when each instrument would enter, which themes would harmonize, and how the final movement would resolve. "You felt for Frontenac," I observed. "I recognized a professional analog," Wolfe replied. "His kitchen is his domain, ordered to his liking, responsive to his judgment. For months, vandals had been telling him that domain was porous, his judgment suspect, his artistry vulnerable to invisible hands. That is not simply an injury to trade. It is an assault on identity." He took a sip of brandy, his expression thoughtful. "We are all entitled to our craft, Archie. To do it well, to fail at it honestly, to improve or decay by our own efforts. Interference for gain is inevitable, but interference for amusement, dressed as moral correction, that I despise." The office settled into its familiar quiet. Outside, the city continued its restless churning, but inside the brownstone, everything had slid back into place. Wolfe opened his book, marking the transition from detective to private citizen. "Tomorrow, Archie, we return to our own routine. No more excursions. No more dining with diplomats and saboteurs. And I find the dramatic requirements of the outside world exhausting." "You handled the drama pretty well for a recluse." "I merely applied logic to hysteria," he said, already absorbed in his reading. "It is a tiring business." I walked out to check the front door lock one last time. The brownstone was quiet now, orchids sleeping in the plant rooms, Fritz humming in the kitchen, Nero Wolfe reading in his chair. Order had been restored, the menu was complete, and justice, for once, had been served with proper seasoning. In the world of Nero Wolfe, that was as close to perfection as mortal men could reasonably expect. Sunday morning arrived with the comfortable weight of resolved chaos, the kind of silence that follows a storm when you're safe inside watching the cleanup from your window. I found Wolfe in the office at 9:30, reading the Times with the expression of a man reviewing his own handiwork from a respectful distance. "Carmichael made the front page of Arts," I reported, settling into my chair with coffee that Fritz had brewed strong enough to wake the dead. "He calls it the night culinary sabotage met its match. Very dramatic. You get described as the legendary detective whose intellectual precision rivals any chef's culinary mastery." "Excessive," Wolfe muttered, but his lips curved slightly upward. The article was comprehensive. Dane's systematic campaign, Brennan's commercial conspiracy, Beaumont's coordination, and Paolo's redemptive confession, all laid out with the kind of detail that would fuel restaurant industry gossip for months. More importantly, Carmichael had emphasized Frontenac's artistry alongside the evening's drama, transforming potential scandal into vindication. "Follow-up reports came in this morning," I continued. "Philip Dane spent Saturday night explaining food tampering to the police. They're charging him with reckless endangerment. His publisher dropped his book contract before breakfast. Thomas Brennan flew back to Boston on the first available flight. His New York expansion dreams are effectively dead. Nicole Beaumont has been recalled to Paris for urgent consultations. Diplomatic immunity protects her from prosecution, but her career in cultural affairs is finished. Wolfe absorbed this information with the satisfaction of a man watching dominoes fall in precisely the order he'd arranged. And Paolo, still employed. Frontenac decided that a sommelier who confessed and returned the bribe demonstrated more integrity than one who'd never been tested. Paolo's working double shifts to prove himself worthy of the second chance. Appropriate. Redemption should require effort, not merely regret. Fritz appeared carrying a package wrapped in butcher paper. "From Le Bernardin Noir, sir." Inside were 2 portions of pâté, a jar of pristine saffron, and a handwritten note on cream paper. "Mr. Wolfe, words cannot express my gratitude. You saved not merely my reputation, but my faith in justice within a profession often governed by ego and envy. Should you ever require culinary assistance, my kitchen is at your disposal. With profound respect, Marcel Frontenac." Wolfe examined the saffron with genuine appreciation, inhaling its complex aroma. Authentic Spanish, unmarred by eggshell or malice. "Tell Fritz these are to be incorporated into this week's menu. Real saffron deserves proper application, not symbolic appreciation." He settled back in his chair with the finality of a mountain returning to rest. "The case provides a useful reminder, Archie. We often view crime as violence. Guns, knives, blunt instruments, but the most corrosive crimes are committed between courses. The betrayal of trust, the corruption of standards, the slow erosion of confidence. These leave no corpses, but they kill excellence just the same. Well, you saved the patient and got a decent meal out of it." "The meal was exceptional," Wolfe corrected. "But more importantly, we demonstrated that artistry deserves protection from those who mistake manipulation for mastery." Dane wrapped spite in moral outrage. Brennan called sabotage positioning. Beaumont baptized control as cultural stewardship. Only Paolo was honest enough to name his hunger and relinquish it when conscience demanded. "So, what's the lesson for posterity?" Wolfe's eyes half closed in the expression that means his brain is distilling wisdom from experience. Appetite, Archie, is the most honest of human drives. A man may disguise greed as prudence, lust for power as altruism, vanity as principle. But what he truly wants, on his plate, in his work, from his life, betrays his character completely. Excellence attracts both admirers and enemies. The key is ensuring the former outnumber the latter at your table. The aroma of roasting duck drifted from the kitchen. Fritz's Sunday specialty. Wolfe's nose twitched appreciatively, his mind shifting from criminology to gastronomy. "Lunch in 20 minutes, Fritz announced from the doorway. Wolfe closed his book, marking his place with careful precision. The world is full of people trying to rewrite other men's menus, Archie. Substituting ambition for talent, manipulation for skill. Occasionally, it becomes necessary to remind them that excellence cannot be counterfeited, only earned, protected, and properly seasoned. He rose from his chair and headed toward the dining room. The case was closed, justice served, and the brownstone restored to its proper order. Outside, the city continued its restless churning, but inside these walls, everything was exactly as it should be. In Nero Wolfe's world, that was the finest recipe for satisfaction. Order maintained, excellence protected, and dinner served on time.